going to draw two beautiful doggies today. We are going to try our best to get them. So not to pressure, the clock is ticking, but we're going to do our best to look at some methods of drawing. And I do want to show you some techniques, very easy techniques that you can use and begin to ask the question, okay, how do I begin to draw this beautiful profile of a dog here? Some of us may have a way of just going at it, and we don't wonder or ask, okay, why do I start here at the eye and then begin to build? How did I choose the pattern of lines and the things that, how I arranged those elements? I want to show you something, a great method that I hope all of you get to try and work alongside with me. So putting aside, and if you do know it, put it to the test and look for new things. This one, it's basically called blocking, enveloping. I'd like to simplify it with three very simple rules. And it is going from biggest to smallest, simplest to more complex, and lightest to dark. How do we do that? First thing we want to do is visualize our image. And do we see the simplest shapes? And simplest shapes, we're going to look for lines, circles, squares, triangles, and the angle of those lines. By the way, today we have graphite on paper. I am using my SAS sketchbook. And I wanted to show you, I'm using HB, 2B, 4B pencil. A nice, beautiful mono eraser, a very tiny eraser that I could draw light back into my drawing with. I have a kneaded eraser, which is great for picking up textures, especially when we have fur like this. And if you have it, I usually recommend having a paper blender or a Q-tip or some cotton that you can rub the graphite with to create layers and blend the graphite into the paper. Now, one of the things I do always is try to simplify what we're trying to do here into all we're doing is putting pencil marks on a paper. Now, those pencil marks could be vertical, horizontal, or diagonal lines. And then we begin to explore a little bit into the curves. So the first stage, I want you to follow along. We're going to look at the size of our drawing. And how do I place these lines if I'm not really accurate or getting a sense of how big or how small? One other way is to visualize. And I do want to show you something really quick. I have a photocopy. It's pretty much the size of my sketchbook. If you were to take your reference and you drew a line from corner to corner, and I'm going to do my best here, try to do it really quick. I'm using a little red color pencil here. So I'm drawing a diagonal from corner to corner and from corner to corner. And that, depending on how accurate you are with your measurement, shows you the center of your image. That is one clue. So if you draw a diagonal from corner to corner and corner to corner, you're going to have the center of your image. And that center easily gives you your horizon, or this horizontal line that you're going to want to find and visualize for your vertical as well. There we have it. And just do this really quick. There we are. Now I want to specify this. I don't have to draw these lines on my sketchbook. What I want to do is visualize them. If you had to, if you feel you want a more accurate, more like your reference in terms of likeness, you want to be accurate, then we would create the grid and it'll be in proportion to what we actually just did with this reference. What other clues do I begin to look for? So when I'm looking for example, this line here, I could begin to see that, okay, it covers somewhere and it goes right across the middle. So it's about halfway there, and begin to do that. If I were to, again, visualize, I'm just going to do a very light vertical and horizontal, kind of to pinpoint my center here. Very light lines, you don't see them, in order to kind of get the sense of that. And very loosely, what I'm looking for is the length and the angle of these lines. What is a great tip for really capturing these angles? So one that I use is the clock. So 12 o'clock, this would be 3 o'clock, this would be 6 o'clock, and this would be 9 o'clock. Everything in between, you can kind of visualize that as 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. So just as a quick reference, I could tell that this is not 12 o'clock. 12 o'clock would be here. And it's maybe close to 1, almost 2 o'clock. Is that? Actually, 2 o'clock would be somewhere over here. So it looks like it's like a 12:30. And if you're having trouble with those analog clocks, we would need to revisit, since everything is digital now, just the angle of the line. What's another way? With your reference, you could literally place your pencil on the line, just like I did here. I'll do it with the red pencil so you could see it. And just like that, transfer the angle right over. So notice that I'm just a little bit off, just a little bit more vertical. If I wanted to be really accurate, I could just do that. I could transfer just a pencil over the line and measure the angle and just really lay it over. So that's how you would do this. Using the clock method, the layover method, you can take the measurements and simplify these lines. So notice that this one, if you follow with me here, is this a vertical line? Some of us, believe it or not, we would draw it as a 6 o'clock or as a 90 degree straight down. And I've seen it where the line is actually going the opposite way. So how do you capture and see the line in that angle is going to make all of the difference. Now, one more important point here. Do you see where this line ends? And do you see how it lines up with this one here, with this point? Is this point higher, lower, or is it level with this one? So you begin to look for those relationships between these angles and lines. Here comes a big one. So I want to make sure, and I double check several times to make sure I get that proper angle. And now I'm beginning to see a little bit of a compositional issue here. I got a little too close to this edge. So I was actually following the image just like on my reference. Now, is that line anywhere near? Make sure you check it. And this would be the stage where if you have a way to check it, double check it, correct it, it would be now that you want to make adjustments. You do not want to wait until later where you're going to have to erase all of that work that you've done and waste all that time, basically. So looking for relationships, making sure you capture that angle. Here comes another one. And I'm seeing that this just goes a little bit longer, right to the tip. Now, how did I know that? I'm going to show you. I did that halfway line and the vertical line, dividing my page into halves. And looking at this reference that I did here, it's not cheating. It's actually corroborating your work. You notice that this line that divides the image in half, top and bottom, it points right there. So I see the tip of the nose, what will be the nose, going past the middle on the bottom part. So that's why my tip of the nose is going to be past. It shouldn't be up here. It has to be down here. And you don't want it to be all the way down here. It's really close, just over and following that angle at the tip. So that's how we would use this for reference. Notice that when I come to this line here, I'm coming really close to the middle, vertical, for reference, but not past it and not too far away from it. So I would easily just draw this and make sure once I have that angle, I know pretty easy how to get there. So we got another angle. And the other thing you're going to need to look for is measure the size of your lines and make sure this one's not way longer than or actually shorter than this one. So the relationship between the points begins to come together. And the truth is, you are going to be able to come up with your own way of seeing, your own techniques. And there we have it. Okay, so I took a little too long explaining this. If you're working way ahead of me, you're probably done. I wanted to go by stages, just really make sure we get this. Now, if I were to show this to 10 4-year-olds, I'm guessing at least 5 would say a dog. Some may say a horse or a llama, but it's starting to look like a thing that we are actually working towards. Here's one more. From here, we want to go here, but there's steps to make these lines, and you're looking at the image on screen. How do we make these lines into these lines? And we're going to begin to go the philosophy, the strategy of from biggest and simplest to smaller and more complex. So these lines are as big as I can make them, and they're going to get smaller and a little curvier, therefore more complex. But before we go there, I wanted to show you those reference points that as we begin to put together some of those relationships, we're going to see that, okay, if the back of my neck here, where there's a big curve, doesn't line up with the bottom part of my eye or at the top eyelid, and again, finding those points of reference like this, not necessarily the halfway point, but any other mark in your drawing. For example, here you see where the neck bends down and turns into vertical. If you were to visualize a line straight up, we're going to see that that is left of the eye, of the corner of the eye, and it lines up perfectly with the bottom of the far ear and then goes across just the top of it. So looking for these relationships from point to point and angle to angle is going to be your job as we develop these lines. Now, I don't want you to copy these lines, so I'm going to get rid of this image and I'm going to let you work from the actual reference. So in order for you to begin to break this structure into smaller, what I want you to do is really begin to pay attention to not just your subject, but the space around it. And that is called negative space. So there are shapes around your subject that also have an interesting shape. So for example, here's one. I have a shape that you may be seeing as just the bottom of the head where the neck is and the beginning of the back. So notice that there's a little curve. And if I were to show you the curvature of this area here and just fill it in. So what you're seeing here as black graphite, the dark area, if you were to look at that shape, just this little area here, does that match that same space around the back of the neck of my reference? And it is easier for you to begin to see, oh, look at that. There's a small curve that goes in here and then rounds out the opposite way here. So you're looking at both the subject and the space simultaneously. Now, another way would be to break this into smaller and smaller segments. So notice how I went with one big line. Here I can begin to find the roundness and the curvature. And we're going to do this a little bit looser. I'm still working with my HB pencil, so it should be a lot lighter. Your line should be a lot lighter as you build up towards dark as well. And one thing you should be avoiding at all costs right now is detail. Yes, if you decided to do lines as a grid for reference, the idea today is for you to begin to figure out what is the easiest way for you to draw a dog the way you see it. And some of you may say, well, this is all not interesting for me. I'm going to go the way I use. What I'm hoping is that you may discover one thing, just one thing, that may help you make it easier. So yes, any method, any strategy that you can pick up on. So right now I'm making smaller, more complex lines, but notice that they're not the final. And as I decide to draw a line, I'm trying to look for references. So drawing straight lines here and visualizing other relationships between my subject. Now my top of my head here. This, I think, when we draw animals, portraits, things that are familiar to us, people, cats, dogs, horses, when we deal with the roundness of the features of the face, we tend to have lots and lots of problems. That is where you need to forget about what you know and actually look at the thing that's in front of you. So here I'm using that smaller line, more complex, and I'm looking at the curvature of it. The easiest way for me to see it is seeing both the subject and the space. So imagine drawing the space around the dog, not the actual dog. Do you see the shape of that? And that complements the way you're seeing your subject. Should actually give you these beautiful, beautiful, subtle curves that give your drawing all of the likeness, that characteristic where people will recognize and can actually put a name on it. This is where it happens with these smaller, more complex, and very, very, very subtle curves. So here I'm actually working towards it, and I'm just getting a little bit darker, cleaning up some of these lines from my earlier setup. They become more difficult to erase as we build more and more lines. So when you feel you don't need them anymore, you could just do one eraser pass here. Clean it up just a little bit as you continue constructing your drawing. Now, not to use your hand, you can use a brush just to get that out so you don't really smudge the graphite. There we go. We continue. Now I'm looking at that line that I showed you earlier, visualizing it from the top of the ear, bringing it down, and I can see right here. Now I'm beginning to see a little more fur, but I have my points. I'm very happy with my early setup, and I'm going to begin to notice how I'm grabbing my pencil. I'm using the side of it so I could use it a little bit wider, giving me a little bit of a different pencil mark. It's not so sharp and thin. It's actually a little thicker and kind of hairier, which makes perfect sense. So I'm going a little bit away from the line into the actual edge of my subject, kind of to save time. That is what I'm going to do later on. So once I have my point and the line, I could actually go into the edges. And is this considered detail? Well, the way I did it, not really. It's just a setup for maybe some blending and some erasing to give us the texture of hair, of fur. Now notice that I'm going kind of simplistic over here. Not a lot of that nuance, curvature that I was talking about. But just refining a little more of the curve, getting away from that sharp, straight line that we did earlier. Here I really need to clean up because it could get confusing. And now, the next thing I want to do, one thing I should have mentioned way earlier is squinting. If you're not squinting at your reference every now and then, you're missing a lot of even really essential information. When you squint, and I mean really seeing just through your eyelashes, what you do is you blur the information, and all you see is big shapes of light and shadow. So when you really squint and you try to see, as I'm squinting now, you begin to see that, wow, there's a big line of shadow right here under the jaw. There's big dark shapes right here where my mouth is going to be. There's obviously dark right here at the tip. I can actually break it down into smaller and smaller shapes. But it is evident, it's obvious how you can begin to structure your drawing. There's another one right here. And just begin to capture the shape of it. Notice the looseness of my lines. I'm really just laying down graphite, really staying conscious of the shapes of those shadows that I'm seeing. And I hope you can see them too. Because before we do anything else, starting to add little hairs and trying to draw every single little hair, what you want to do is get the general, again, biggest, simplest, before you get smaller and more complex. So these biggest ones, notice that there's some really darker, well, I want to say not really dark, but there are darker ones, and then a bit lighter. So you don't want to confuse those. You begin to see them smaller and more accurate. And eventually, without even attempting to draw any detail, I'm just adding masses of darks and lights. And look what that did to it. It's, in the end, when you begin to add and turn lines into shapes, those shapes, in order for them to create the illusion of three-dimensionality of, in this case, your dog, what you have to do is capture the light. Capture the light and shadow. And that is the ultimate trick that we're trying to do here. Imitate the light, the reading of the light, in order for us to create the illusion. Notice how some of them are getting darker. And a lot of this has been done by my squinting. And you could get really, really loose with this, really loose. But the moment you stop looking for the lights and shadows and then trying to draw details instead of shapes that kind of build up slowly into more and more complex, you kind of lose your sense of what is essential. And you could do a drawing like this with very limited lines and still create something that will be recognizable, that we'll all know exactly where you got it from. Oh my gosh, that is the dog we were all drawing, with very, very limited lines. What we're doing here is deciding how many lines do I need to draw this dog. Some of us may use 1,000, 3,000. Some of us have to go to 1,000,000. Some of us could try to do it in 10. And every single one is going to have a different look. So at this point, as I'm building my lights and shadows, this is the point where you could begin to blend. Just for texture, you can actually bring in your paper blender or your cotton ball, your Q-tip, and create those masses to soften up some of the edges. Because we begin to look at contrast and how we build contrast of line, contrast of sharpness of the line, softness of the line, contrast of lightness of the line or darkness of the line, of the shapes in this case. And at the same time, you begin to see the volume. Now, one big tip when we draw pets, dogs, cats, fur, is to follow the way that hair, that fur is growing. So you could see it here very obviously. It grows and it layers and it follows a curve that goes just like this. And you see it more at the edge where the hair is becoming, again, it's just contrast. You see the shadow. Here you begin to see lines, again, of the hair. And the more patient you are with this in actually seeing which direction and which shape that fur, that hair is growing and kind of clashing and blending and mixing with the other parts, that is going to be your success. So notice all the different curves. And I said it before, you do not have to draw every single little hair. You could see them as shapes and simplify them so they become shapes with a specific direction. So kind of clumps. Our brain does the rest. Our brain will interpret it. Oh, look at that. And decode your message to see it as fur. We're going to see pencil lines as a dog, a furry dog. And this is another area where you can actually run into, I don't want to say trouble, but too much contrast on this line. It needs to be a little bit lighter. That's what we're looking for. Combinations of contrasts. I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my 2B pencil. So my HB is done, and now I'm going to go to a little bit of a darker pencil where I could begin to just refine. Oop, that one jumped right away. You could see how as I touch a little bit of 2B, my pencil marks get immediately much darker. So I could do more emphasis, more contrast. And I'm just going to go a little bit smaller and more complex. And yes, we would call this detail, but I'm still simplifying. I'm still looking for those shapes of light and shadow. And the more accurate you can actually interpret the direction, the angle, the shape, the value, meaning how dark or how light, the better you're going to capture not just the personality and the expression, but the full character and personality of this dog. And as you realize that, my gosh, all we do is combine the variety of lines that I can come up with as I kind of decode them, as I see them. And that's when you're realizing that all of this is an exercise in observation. How observant, how much information can you take away and simplify and transfer onto the paper. Going a little bit into that negative space that I mentioned before, where I could see it a little bit easier. And I did get a little too close to the edge here with my composition. There's a variety of dark and shadow shapes here in this black mass. You could actually break it down. The closer you look, you'll realize, wow, there's a lot of information there. So I'm just darkening. And I'm going to begin to just add a few of these specks in here that are just a little darker. Pattern arrangement of spots. A little more shadow right over the mouth. And I do want to bring in my eraser, just to be able to actually add a layer of light. And obviously we would have, depending on what stage you are with your dog, at the very end, you're going to want to bring out some light and some blurriness. Not just anywhere, but again, by squinting and drawing it in. This is not erasing. This is drawing with your eraser. So creating, for example here, just a little more gray area. And there's that curvature that is so difficult to capture. So you're looking at bone structure. And all it is lighter and darker, in this case, curvier areas of lights and shadows. Some a little brighter, some a little sharper, some a little smaller. And there we have it. A quick sketch, but a lot of fun. I'm going to flip the page over. If you're still working, I hope you have the reference. I am going to switch the image over to our dog number 2, which is this one. And I'm going to apply the same method. A little, starting with pretty much first step 1. And notice the arrangement of geometric shapes that you could do here. You probably, as soon as you do this, are pretty close to done. And once again, visualizing, if you have a reference and you have your center, and I have this just with the vertical going right down the middle. I did measure, so I have that as my middle vertical and this as my middle horizontal. And just as a reference, notice where that lands, right in the center left of my nose. So that is great to know. It almost runs right down the middle of right here, the crease between the eyebrow. And it's going to be a great point of reference. Look at our horizontal, how we see just barely at the tip of the ears, obviously right through the nose, and at the tip of the other ear. And that is going to be very, very helpful as we set up this biggest, simplest shape. I'm going to try to do a little bit of a better job with my proportions and my composition. So I do draw just very lightly my vertical, my horizontal, and already I know right here one of my biggest pieces in composition is there. Now the second elements, as I begin to create relationships between them, notice how many diagonals, the space between one and the other. And it all comes down to angles. The sharper your angles, the closer you are to the actual length and angle, the better your drawing is going to be. So I hope that tip with the clock works. Notice here, this edge gives me another reference that would come right about there and right about here. And I know the middle, the center of my line, so a lot of this could be called triangulation. When you look for one angle and that angle gives you a reference for the second and third point, you actually begin to use it and you could get so accurate. You could become really, really accurate if you are capturing the right angles of the lines. And what I really, really wanted you to take away from today's session is the realization all we're doing is putting down lines, arranging lines into shapes, and those shapes, when we begin to add light and shadow, become forms, and the illusion of three-dimensionality, it's a trick, and how you can manipulate it, really, use it to create, to let your creativity basically run wild. Once again, looking at relationships between our lines, our shapes. And the closer you look, the more time you take sometimes to stop, look how everything is relating, how is this, every part in relationship to the one you just did. And actually be able to confirm it before you move on. So as I do this line, before I move on, I want to make sure, do I have a way? Can I find a way? Is there a point of reference that will allow me to check it, confirm it, and move on? Before I do that, I want to make sure, because otherwise you're going to build whatever you put on top of this line and comes later. If it's wrong, then everything else on top of that is going to be wrong. And when I say wrong, you'll have that feeling of, why doesn't it look exactly like I want it to? So there it is. I have step 1. Moving towards step 2. And once again, from biggest to smallest, I want you to see it. See it simpler. There it is. If we look at this drawing, you would agree that it is way simpler to draw this than just try to draw this. So building this in order to get there is the idea, for you to just read all the parts and be able to see it and piece by piece put it together like a puzzle. And then there's one more. From here we would go to here. So notice I'm going to do that switch again so you can see how those lines eventually become smaller and more complex, and eventually giving you something like this. So we could do that, or we could just go right back to our reference and do it from there. So hopefully you get that when you're looking at this, after step 1, I want you to be looking for something like this. That's simple, that you could then build on. So there we have it. Before we get into detail, here I begin to look at negative space. So where do I even start? For some reason, I want to start here. And I'm going to do this one a little bit looser, a little more gestural. What does that mean? It doesn't mean less precise. A little bit. But it actually, the way I do this, the way I'm drawing right now, it's not exactly blind drawing, but I am looking at my reference 98, 99% of the time. And what's happening on my paper, I check it every 10 seconds maybe. Every time I need to place my pencil down, back on an area, or check for the proportion as it's working, if it's but most of the lines are coming from me interpreting, actually seeing what I see in my reference. And we're moving a little bit past biggest to smallest, simplest to complex, although this is still stage 2 of very simple. I'm beginning to follow some of these lines because I could actually see the hair. So it's just a curved line, and it almost looks finished. I could leave this and you could really see what's going on here. You could begin to read texture. Before I have to add to it, you could actually see, oh, I know that type of doggy ear. And again, moving on to, without getting caught up in that wanting to stay stuck in an area for half an hour, what you want to do is move around all the way through as you build your curves, your smaller. Maybe bring an eraser to clean up what you don't need anymore. That could confuse you, by the way. As you move from one side, I could see this line. Once again, my eyes are staring. I sometimes forget to blink. Looking at my reference, gazing just for a second at my paper. My eyes are really, the more my eyes, think about this, the more my eyes are on my subject, the more I'm looking at it, the more I'm observing it. So if this is an exercise in observation, why would you be looking at your paper? Look at your subject. Look at your reference. And I think that, if I say a mistake, biggest mistake people make is staring down at your paper, making up information, forgetting about your reference. Especially when you think you know it. And what I mean by you think you know it, when we know people, dogs, cats, birds, we tend to make up information because we know what a chest or a nose looks like. Eyes, we know that. I'll skip the hands and feet unless I have to look at them. So that's why you would want to really simplify the shape as I'm looking at it. I'm not trying to draw fur or chest here. What I'm doing is I'm looking for shapes, and I'm beginning to see at this stage, I'm beginning to see what's lighter and darker, and making my line lighter or darker. So it kind of relates, and I begin to see make a few corrections. And I'm seeing shapes within the shape. So I'm seeing this circle on top of another circle. And it's not a circle, it's more of a sphere. And this, when you see this nose here, what you want to see it as is a cube. A cube that has a front, a top, and sides. See what I did here? And one of these sides is darker. The side that's on the shadow area. Split kind of in the middle. And then has two little shapes that also become darker. Right in here. But the more you look at your subject, the more accuracy you will be able to have. There's little shapes of light and shadow as you see them here. And maybe I'll use a little bit of blender. So mastering, really mastering the values, meaning lights and darks you can create with your pencils, is what's key here. Can you create a nose that looks like a dog's nose from the different values that you can create? Sometimes we bring in an extra tool like a Q-tip or a paper blender, and we're going to blend some of that graphite to create some of that illusion. Notice how that happened really quickly. And how I would bring in this guy to erase some light. So I'm drawing with it. And I could use different types of pressure. to bring back some light. So I'm not erasing, I'm drawing with it. And I could create second and third layers here. So it also requires patience. You can work really fast, be very gestural, but a little bit of patience to put together those elements. And then the quality of your lines. So seeing that there's a little bit of texture here. So breaking up your line, adding the layer, and then knowing how dark is too dark and how light is too light, and managing everything in between is going to make a difference here. And I'm using all kinds of different techniques. Hatching, meaning parallel lines, or scumbly, which are like circular lines, to give us that nice doggy nose texture. Notice how there's a little bit of just under, right into the mouth that we don't see. A little bit more blending. And although that area is white, or white fur, I could actually come back and just pull out some of that and create some furry texture. It begins to look realistic. So let's continue with, in this case, my contour, my edges. I got a little caught up here. See, I went too far with detail, but I did want to show you that. So you could finish on your own if you need to. If I'm working a little fast or too slow, you're able to just continue on your own, figure it out using this method. Notice here on this side, I have this beautiful round mouth, and right underneath, I have a lot of shadow. So the contrast that I'm going to create right here on the side, going a little bit right back into negative space. So I'm looking at the edge around this line that I'm drawing. And then the contrast. And I want to blend this, really give it a nice look, because you barely see, when it gets this dark, the texture of the fur as it moves away into the light. Then you begin to see it easier. So we could just darken this. And then just softly create that contrast between the face and the neck right in this area. We have that going on over here, by the way, a little bit smoother. And that is going to begin to give us, notice how the face is coming forward. So that is created by contrast. Notice how we did that with just a little bit of darker lines, blended or not. I'm creating a little bit of separated lines here, a little bit of pattern of lines that will also create that illusion of fur falling, that little bit of texture. And then, as I said also a few times, you decide how far is too far. When you reach a point where, okay, that's enough detail. It's actually the last thing an artist does, and one of the most difficult, which is to decide when a drawing is finished. Can I call this finished? No, we all know that. Not yet. But what else do I need? How much more do I need to be able to call this finished? So next thing would be, I would go into here just a little more to match some of this. This looks done. This could pass as done. This can definitely pass as done. Some of these lines are going to get us also closer. And it's just about playing with your lines, having fun with a whole different variety, coming up with new ones. So again, I'm simplifying the shape. I'm not thinking about the thing, what we call this thing that I'm drawing right now. I don't even say the word. I'm looking at curves. I'm looking at elements, lines. I'm looking at circle, sphere, and most importantly, I'm looking at sharpness, softness, darkness, or lightness. And there's a lot of light play here. So some things get really dark, and then there's really, really light right next to it. And there's a difference between them. So how I put those lines and those elements together, that's your mastery. That's what we're looking for. How to make this fun. And it is really by simplifying those shapes. Seeing everything as in its simplest form. And being able to read the lightness or darkness and then transfer it with the techniques of pencil. All the different techniques you can use. Let's bring in that Q-tip to create a little bit of glossiness here. So more of that glassy eye effect. I left a little bit of highlight right in there, but I'm going to use, again, our friend, and I'm going to say the name again. This is our Tombow, Tombow. And I'll share a link to this in the email with the video link, and it's called the Mono Zero Elastometer Eraser. So we bring back some of that light, and have, let's see, right here, just a little extra sharp line falling as eyelashes, and a little bit of dark right around the eye. And there you have it. You're really coming with the answers of how many lines do I need to get us to finished. Now notice that we're here in the shadow area. So I don't want to just fill this up with, I want to say it again. Fur, hair, you really, really make or break by figuring out what is the direction, what is the shape, and following it, meaning the way that fur, that hair grows. If you begin to add lines in any direction, it'll just flatten it. It will make it look, it'll fight it actually. So you want to get a sense of how that hair grows, how it falls, and then you could actually bring in the blending tool and round it, creating a more realistic effect of muscle and bone structure underneath. So you begin to see break in the light and shadow, and that's the illusion coming together of, oh, look at that. Look how that cheek in the right here under the eye, how you have that curvature. How it falls in, concave, convex. All those words of how do I draw that? Well, you just follow the line, the shape of the line, the direction, and very easily create that illusion. It is easy when you simplify it and break it down. Again, thinking, I'm not even going to say the word, because all I see is a circle, sphere, with lots of contrasting and subtle breaks in shadow, light, squinting, blurring, refocusing what you're looking at, breaking it down, giving it attention. All it requires is a little bit of pause, attention, for you to see it. This is actually a really interesting eye here because it's in the shadow, but it has a subtle gloss, a reflective light gloss in the eye, but we still don't see the pupil. So you're going to really want to master the shadow area of your drawing, meaning there's a lot of darks that are not just plain dark. Did that make sense? When you look at the shadows, there's shadows and light within the shadows. So it's not just black. It's not just shadow. It's tons of reflected light, tons of shadow, and some that really, really get dark. So I may have to switch to a darker lead, a darker pencil. And I should mention, for this drawing, I used mechanical pencils with HB 2H, and I also have 2B pencil leads. And I like it because they stay sharp. You don't have to stop and sharpen. And you can do ultra, ultra fine lines. So having a set of pencils, great. But if you can begin to master your drawings with the exact type of lead that you want to use, I recommend having mechanical pencils just for the convenience of not having to sharpen. I showed you earlier how having pencils, in order to use the side and the thickness of the pencil to create the textures, that's one thing that lacks, that you can't do, or you definitely can't do it as well with mechanical pencils. Here I'm bringing in all the gloss and then just trying to draw the light back out with the eraser. And I'll do that a few times. You don't want to overdo it. You begin to lose that quality of layering. It becomes mushy and overdone. And that's one thing. My last reference of the day. Or ways of saying it. When you cook, it could be raw or it could be burnt. A drawing, if it's undercooked, you could always cook it a little more. But if you overcook it, you most likely will lose it. It's really hard to bring a drawing back once it goes past a certain point. Now, what is that point? It depends on the situation. It depends on how you made the choices. It's hard to say, but you'll know it. Trust me, I hope it doesn't, if it hasn't happened yet. One day, if it happens, you'll know it. And then hopefully you learn from it and have the discipline and the patience to remember next time. Give it time. Take breaks. Stop in between to make the right decision at different times. And my goodness, what a beautiful dog this is, as it's coming more and more together. And this is how I would draw a dog. Now, it's not the only way, as I said. The idea here is for you to pick up on the things that, makes sense. Ooh, that works. I'm going to use that. And make that yours. Your style, your way of drawing, because it is the way you see the world, the way you see life. So interpreting that and making a strategy of it, that's the goal. I hope you guys enjoyed it.